Okay, so this is a brief tutorial on the Protist kingdom, and this is going to be our first kingdom that we're going to get into, that we're now shifting into eukaryotic cells. And if you remember, eukaryotic cells are going to be those cells that are complex. They're going to have organelles, they're going to have a nucleus. We studied both animal and plant cells earlier on. And these cells that we're going to look at actually kind of fall into those animal or plant category as far as what they look like. But the difference here is that when we get into protists, we're going to be able to see these things under the microscope. So we talked about before with bacteria, when we talked archaeobacteria and eubacteria, that they're really small. And even with our highest power on the microscope, our high power, we weren't really going to be able to see any bacteria with great detail. Many of the pictures that we looked at under the microscope for bacteria were electron microscope images on the board. So now we're shifting into protist, which is going to be an example of eukaryotic cells. So they're a lot bigger. They have nuclei, they have organelles, and all those different kind of things like that, which means that we're going to be able to see a lot of these different organisms underneath the microscope. So hopefully at this point, before you're watching this video, you've already gone and watched the Kingdom Protista Protist video on Discovery Education. It's about 7 minutes long, and it provides a great overview of the Protist kingdom. You're going to see Protist and Protista kind of used interchangeably here. Protista is simply just going to be the Latin way that we say Protist as far as this kingdom goes. So let's dive right in. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what is a protist? All right, and most of the protists that we're going to look at are going to be single-celled eukaryotic cells that can't be classified as plant, animal, or fungi. So these are kind of the odds and ends, and we really consider the protists the odds and ends of the living world. And when we say that, it's because they're the ones that really can't fit into any of the other categories. They're not really plants because, they may do photosynthesis, but then they move. Or they might be animals, but then they have some kind of odd things like a cell wall. So they kind of really don't fit into either of those categories. And the majority of the protists that we're going to look at will be single-celled. And it's kind of cool to look at because you've got a whole organism with one cell. And it's kind of interesting to see how they move around. And we're actually going to be looking at some live examples of protists under the microscope and a variety of different things. So the majority of them are single-celled eukaryotes, with the nucleus and organelles and things like that. But there are a couple examples in the plant-like protists that we're going to see that are multicellular. So let's dive right into our first one, which are going to be the animal-like protist. So the animal-like protists, we actually have a kind of a name that we give them. They're called protozoans. So any of the protozoans that we happen to see over the course of the next week or so are going to be those animal-like protists. And animal-like protists are going to be classified by how they move. Some are not going to move at all. Others are going to use flagella, and others are going to use what are called pseudopods, which we actually kind of talked a little bit about before. So they're all going to be based on how they get around. So how are they going to get from point A to point B? The first type of animal-like protist or protozoan that we come across are those that are going to move using their flagella. Now, flagella is that whip-like tail. This is now the second or third time that we've talked about this. The flagella, we saw an example with the bacteria. It's a whip-like tail that is going to allow a protist to move. It either is going to whip counterclockwise or clockwise, which allows that movement to occur. The next type of animal-like protist that we're going to see are those that are going to have pseudopods or false feet. And they're going to extend their cytoplasm to kind of form these finger-like structures. The amoeba is the greatest example of this. We kind of saw that amoeba early on when we talked about cell transport actually consuming that paramecium in that video. And then the next type of animal-like protists that are going to move are those that are going to move using their cilia. And cilia are kind of like these teeny hair-like structures that act like oars. Kind of think like the feet on a centipede or a millipede. There's a lot of them, and they kind of just use them to move through some type of liquid. We also do have some animal-like protists that actually don't even move at all. These tend to be parasites, which means they're going to have to hitch a ride on a host and to get from point A to point B. Now, the one thing you do want to know is that all of the animal-like protists are considered heterotrophs, and what that means is that they're going to have to go out and eat their food. Now, as we kind of saw with our amoeba, when we looked at cell transport, it was eating. We saw it eating. It extended those false feet, it wrapped it around some food, and it broke down, digested that in such a way where it was able to eat it. So let's take some pictures and look at what they kind of look like. These are 4 examples. So the first one is going to be our amoeba, and as we talked about before, this is going to use those false feet or pseudopods to move from point A to point B, and you actually can see in this image that the amoeba is probably in the process of eating whatever that small algae or whatever that happens to be. The next one that we're going to look at is the paramecium. This is going to use cilia to get around. We're actually going to look at some live paramecium under the microscope, and we're actually going to look at some live amoeba as well. And paramecium, we're going to use those little kind of tiny feet to get around. Here is an example. Giardia is an example of a particular animal-like protist that's going to use whip-like structures to get around. Maybe you've heard of Giardia before. It's going to be a beaver fever kind of thing. It does cause problems if you were to consume this particular protist. But here's an example of something that's a pathogen. It's bad for you. It makes you sick. That isn't a virus. That isn't a bacteria, and actually is a protist. And here's some additional parasites down here. These are all going to be examples of protists that are going to get you sick, or they're going to leach on to different organisms to get from point A to point B. Let's take a look at our plant-like protists. So the common name that we give plant-like protists is algae. So a lot of people were asking earlier on, are plants algae or algae plants, or what is algae or where does it fall into? And most algae are actually going to be protists. They're going to fall into that odds and ends category. They're eukaryotic. They're going to have the ability to probably undergo photosynthesis. But they're usually single-celled. This is where we do kind of get in actually to some multicellular organisms. So we are going to classify our plant-like protists based on the number of cells that they particularly have. And really we're going to have 2 categories. We're going to have the unicellulars, which are only going to be the one-celled plant-like protists. And then we're going to have the multicellulars, which are going to be the plant-like protists that contain few or actually even several cells. Now, the interesting thing to know about the plant-like protists is that they all are photosynthetic. They make their own food. We use the term autotroph to classify any plant-like protist or anything that is going to make its own food. So let's take some images. Let's take a look at them and see what they look like. So here are a whole variety of different examples of plant-like protists. Here's an example of red algae, and then we've also got some brown algae. We've got some green algae here. Now, all of these things are really cool looking, and you're probably familiar with seaweed if you've ever been to the ocean. And seaweed is actually a protist. It's not a plant. It doesn't fall into the plant kingdom. It does have the ability to be photosynthetic. It does kind of grow. It's multicellular, but it lacks kind of a lot of the complexities that we usually consider when we look at living things in the plant kingdom. And because it lacks those complexities, we put it into the protist kingdom. Euglena, very cool, very interesting plant-like protist. It undergoes photosynthesis. It has what's called an eye spot that actually is a kind of a light sensor that allows it to move towards light. And you'll notice down here at the end, it kind of looks like it has a flagella of some sort. And these particular protists actually move around. And we're going to take a look at some of these under the microscope as well. Red tides, these are kind of like another form of algae that we might be looking at. And the last one, we're going to look at some actual slides of diatoms. And these things are really cool. It's kind of like looking at seashells underneath the microscope. They're very small, single-celled organisms. They come in really bizarre and interesting shapes. But we're going to look at them under the microscope and kind of see what they look like. They are protists. They are plant-like protists. They're going to undergo photosynthesis, and they're typically found in water, either the ocean or even just a local pond that you go to. You can find this diatoms in that pond. Actually, most of these protists you can actually find in a pond. And you go to any pond, you get a water sample, and you can take a look at that water sample under the microscope, and you will find some animal-like and some plant-like protists living in that pond. Our last category of protists are fungus-like protists. These are all going to be heterotrophs. So if we go back and think about heterotrophs, what that means, heterotroph is going to be those that are going to eat their food. They can't make it, so they got to eat it. Fungus-like protists also release digestive proteins that are going to help break down dead organisms, called decomposers. They're not the only decomposers. Obviously, funguses in general, the category or kingdom of fungus does that. And there's also bacteria that does that as well. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is why the fungus-like protists are not in the fungus kingdom. They move at some point in their life. All right, they move at some point in their life. Now, I have move in quotations because it's not like they have feet or anything like that. They're not complex in that regard, but they tend to kind of roll. They have that pseudopod kind of rolling nature to them, just kind of throwing cytoplasm and kind of just oozing almost as they move from place to place. And they don't move very far in their life, maybe only a couple centimeters or things like that. But they do move, so we don't put them into the fungus-like kingdom. And let's take a look at some of those images. So we have our first one, slime mold. This is pretty cool looking. Slime mold is going to be one of those things that kind of just oozes all around. It lacks any complexity as far as how it grows and things like that. Water molds and mildews are two other examples. Again, kind of things that, seem like maybe plants or seem like maybe fungus, but because they lack really that complexity that we would associate like with fungus and things like that, we don't see this. Now, this PowerPoint will be available to you, so I would highly suggest that once you've kind of listened through these notes, that you take a look at some of the different things to do here, like explore the pond. This is really cool. It has some great examples in it as far as some things that you could actually find in a pond right by your house. And there's some other things in your notes that you want to make sure that you work through as well. So this is just an overview of the Protist kingdom. Hopefully now you get an understanding of kind of the odds and ends of the living world.